This morning, we're going to pick up on a theme that actually Captain Clark introduced to us, and it's the issue of culture of leadership. He gave a couple metaphors about the building of a culture, barrels and apples and so on. We're going to kind of take that and run with it a little bit this morning. The series of questions that we provided the panelists here this morning are based on midshipman input from earlier on in this semester, and there's some really challenging questions, I think, get to the heart of how it is that one builds a culture of leadership, and I'll give that to you. The military develops leaders differently than does Google, which also has different methods than a humanitarian aid non-governmental organization. In what way is leader development in organizations dependent on the field of work and organizational environment? Or are some characteristics universal? In what ways do organizations foster cultures that reward and enhance leader development, and how do the methods and programs used, such as formal programs versus informal mentorship pairings, affect the outcomes of such programs? What effect do crucible or trial by fire experiences have on the short and long-term development of leaders, and do such programs and experiences differ by who is being developed? That's a mouthful. That's a lot of concepts kind of rolled up into this, but powerful ones that I think will serve to take us from yesterday's introduction in many ways, from Marcus Buckingham, from Governor Ridge and others, kind of build some practical things into this now. How do we go about doing this? Now also, through their wisdom, the conference organizers, I think, have pulled together a panel that is uniquely qualified to answer such tough questions. From your left, my right, I will introduce them very briefly, and then I'm going to basically get out of the way, turn it over to them to offer a couple minutes of thoughts directly answering this challenge about the culture of leadership. And then we'll reserve the bulk of the time, of course, as with the panel yesterday, to take questions from the audience. All right, first off, again, on my right, your left, we'll start with Captain Angela Cyrus. She holds one of the more demanding positions here at the Naval Academy as Director of Admissions, and she also makes the time to teach for us in the leadership department. Her 27 years in the Navy in challenging staff and command positions gives her great insight into the culture of large organizations. Please welcome Captain Angela Cyrus. Next to Captain Cyrus, Mr. Ari Fleischer is president of his own firm, Ari Fleischer Communications Incorporated. He's held a significant series of positions in public service in the private sector. Everyone recognizes him, of course, as the White House press secretary during some of the most challenging times in our nation's history, to include the terrorist attacks of 9/11, the anthrax attacks, and the presidential recount. Please welcome Mr. Ari Fleischer. Mrs. Deirdre Gehant comes to us with extensive experience in the public and private sector, including over 20 years with the Federal Reserve System, where she oversees the development of that organization's most senior leaders. She's taught on behalf of the Aspen Institute and the Center for Creative Leadership. Welcome, Mrs. Deirdre Gehant. And then finally, we have Mr. Walt Havenstein. He's the Chief Executive Officer of Science Applications International Corporation, or SAIC, and former President and CEO of BAE Systems International. U.S. Naval Academy graduate, he's a retired Marine Corps officer with an extensive career in the defense and security industry, with a particular focus on engineering and high tech. Please welcome Mr. Walt Havenstein. Again, as you can see, we've got a panel that's fairly uniquely qualified to answer this question of culture, because they come from such a broad, diverse background on this particular matter. So without any further ado, Captain Cyrus.
I'm particularly delighted to be here and to be in the company of such distinguished panelists. And I'm very excited to just have a moment with you all, because leadership is what I do. It's what we do, something I believe in, something I love talking about. So the fact that we have a class sponsoring a conference such as this is extraordinary, appreciated, and I know you guys are going to take it all in. So I just have a couple comments, but I want to let you know that I come with a couple perspectives. One is organizational in my 27 years in the Navy and the various commands and organizations I've been in. And another is from the perspective of a parent, because I have a couple of you, three boys in all, but 2 in college. And so a lot of the things that I do at work parallel my interactions with them, because it's just who I am. Now, I have a son who's a senior at the University of Virginia and one who's a sophomore at the University of Maryland. And about 7 years ago, I wrote a book for these guys, and it's called Prescriptions for Success in Sports. It's something that they could relate to, and it was my way of teaching principles to them. I said I wrote the book so I don't have to repeat myself. And they'll probably be about 30 when they really come to appreciate it. But this Prescriptions for Success is just kind of sharing principles with them using the letter P, something I thought was easily understandable. There were other adolescents who found it useful. But those are the perspectives that I bring to the table when I start talking about leadership and the culture of leadership with you all. Leadership in general. Well, we know that when we talk about leadership, we're talking about the interaction of forces, necessary forces, the leader, followers, and the situation, right? I mean, you have to have those things present. And all of those things are going to interact to comprise this thing we call culture, these patterns of behavior in any organization. What I want you to focus on or be open to is how you can influence culture, organizational culture. Now let's think about an org chart, all right? You've got a box at the top, the organizational chart. We use a lot of acronyms. You've got a box at the top that represents the leader. And then you come down another level and you may have 4 or 5 or however many. And each of those boxes, you know, they come down and you've got 4 or 5 people reporting to them. I mean, that's our hierarchical structure. That's how we work. So you envision the org chart? You got it? Now, that org chart kind of lays out for us, okay, we're organized to do something. It tells us about the who. It tells us where we are, and if you kind of flowchart it, you can get a sense of how things work. You know, you go to this department, then you go to that department, da-da-da-da-da. But what I want you to think about is that white space in the middle of that org chart. There's a lot of white space in there. And what I want you to consider is the why we do what we do. And that why doesn't always have to be articulated at the top. Hopefully it is. Hopefully it is. But I want you to know that if you spend some time in that white space, that's your opportunity to influence culture. Well, what do I mean? Because in that white space, you're really talking about relationships, interaction, energy. And so what you bring to the table matters. And so there are some things that I want you to understand about yourself so that you can influence that white space. Your purpose. Your purpose. Why'd you get up today? Why are you even here? How many of you have even thought about what it is you're here to do? Living purposefully. Well, if you can bring relevance to the experience of others, if you can operate with purpose, people are naturally attracted to you. If you are positive in your attitude, if you see things in terms of possibilities, if you are always focused on potential, people are attracted to you. You are influencing the culture of an organization. You with me? I mean, we got to stretch out of the box here a little bit. But I want you to spend some time thinking about that, because you don't have to be at the top to influence culture. And I want you to understand that. Leadership can come from anywhere in the organization, and hopefully it does. So I have an 11-year-old son, and when I wake him up in the morning, I say, okay, time to get up. The world awaits you. It's like, yeah, okay, all right, Mom. But the world awaits you. You've got something to do. You have a difference to make. And I just try to sort of get him to think that way. Now, the older boys, they've been coming up with this all the time. They say, Mom, you know, you're a blessing and a curse. I mean, okay, we talked about this before. But influencing their way of thinking has really helped in their success. Now, my boys are soccer players. They both play at ACC. And, you know, they've been the all this and the all that, the American, the region, the prep, all just like you guys, Excellent performers. But along the way, I tried to use the sports metaphor to teach them these life principles. And even with purpose, what are you going to go out there to do? How are things going to be different because you showed up? What's different because of you? And if you can see in others things that they can't see in themselves, you know, that's the gift that keeps on giving. If you see potential in others that they don't yet see in themselves, and then you start to interact with them that way, I mean, you're starting to influence the environment, how people feel about themselves, how they interact with others. You're making them feel positive and optimistic. You have a chance to influence culture if you're operating in the white space. Real quickly, personal power. Personal power is a concept that I absolutely believe in. We call it different things. Yesterday we talked about it in terms of self-assuredness. You know, it's not cocky or anything like that, but it's being okay with who you are. You know, it's understanding that we can all win. Personal power is something that you have that remains with you when you take that rank off, when you go home, when you're not in uniform, when you're not at the top of your class. Personal power is something that you have within. It's an okayness with yourself. And when you're at that place, it really positions you to positively influence others. And when you make a mistake, it allows you to get back up. You know, it's like, bummer, I blew that one. But getting back in the game. So that personal power is something that I want you to think about consciously, because this influences your opportunity to make a difference in your organization and operate in the white space. Lastly, there's this concept of personal victory. Personal victory. If I say to my boys, PV, baby, PV, they know what that means. A personal victory is knowing that you have given everything you had. Whatever it is you're undertaking, you gave it your all. Now, you may win, the team may win, you may not win. It doesn't matter. Because when you walk off the field, you know you left it all there. And so when you're in an organization, you are giving all you have, the best of you. And you're getting back in the game when things go wrong, because they will. That's my starting point with you.
Okay, thank you, Captain Cyrus. Mr. Fleischer.
Well, good morning. You know, a few years ago, in a town not too far away from here, I used to spend a lot of time on this side of a microphone with a lot of other people on that side of the microphone, known as the White House Press Corps. They surrounded me, morning, noon, and night. So believe me, it's a pleasure to be with you. You know, it really is. One of the things I promised myself when I left the White House, and I made this promise to myself because I saw on a very close relationship the top people in the military, all the way through to people who are going to be in the military and be our officers, and many, many of our enlisted men and women. I vowed to myself that any time the military asked me to do anything, my answer was always going to be yes. So thank you for inviting me to be here. There's no better, finer group of future leaders that I can think of than the people in our military. I want to tell you what I observed when it comes to leadership on probably one of the most crucial days when anybody will look back at our history. There are a handful of crucial days that made us free, and this was one of them. And I'm going to share with you what I saw on the inside on September 11th and let you draw your own inferences what it means to be a leader. And I just pray that none of you will have to go through anything like this in your careers, but knowing the history of our country, I suspect you will have to go through something like this. But one of the best parts of my old job was I got to travel everywhere the president went, which meant I got picked up on the South Lawn by Marine One. So for those of you who are going to later become the pilots of Marine One, boy, are they good. They can land a helicopter on a dime on a small South Lawn. I traveled on Air Force One everywhere with the president. Now, not that I minded in any way my U.S. Air flight here, but I miss Air Force One, where I never had to take off my shoes. And even on a rainy Friday in New York, I never once heard the words, "We're number 17 for takeoff." But because I traveled with the boss everywhere, I was with him all day on September 11th. From the moment we went into that schoolroom in Sarasota, Florida, when I got a page telling me as soon as I got out of the motorcade that the World Trade Center had been hit by an aircraft. And like everybody else, I imagined some type of tragic, terrible accident. To the moment I was in that schoolroom with the president, when moments before Andy Card walked into that classroom and whispered in the president's right ear, "The second tower has been hit. America is under attack." I was standing some 15 feet over the president's other shoulder, and I got a page telling me the second tower had been hit. And like everybody, I instantly realized, of course, this has to be terrorism. We boarded Air Force One, and instead of going into my usual spot in my seat on Air Force One, I went directly into the president's cabin and just started taking notes on everything the president did and said that day. And I have the only original notes of what the president did for almost the entirety of that day. But the first thing the president said was, "We're at war. And when I find out who did this, someone's not going to like me as president." He called the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, and he said to Secretary Rumsfeld, "Pretty soon, Don, the ball's going to be in your court and in Dick Meyer's court," then the incoming chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. "The ball will be in your court, and I expect you to clean this up. It's not going to be a slap on the wrist, and it's going to take a while." Right from the beginning of crisis, the commander-in-chief was putting the mission into his subordinates. Right from the first moment. And it was particularly important because on that day, September 11th, when the president addressed the nation, he never used the word war in talking to the country. He wanted to give a message instead of reassurance, of calm. Privately, internally, he was telling the Secretary of Defense and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and from them on down, we are a nation at war. And the mission was crystal clear. Now, the next day, September 12th, the president publicly, for the first time, used the word war to start preparing America for what we were going to have to go through. But that was a lesson to me as the person sitting there as a civilian who had background in domestic matters, not international and certainly not military, about the importance of what the person at the top does and says in clearly defining what comes next for everybody, particularly at a moment of crisis. It helps you think clearly about what your next steps should be. The other notable thing about it was the remarkable calm. The president was just like this, which is interesting to me. I noticed that in him. When we got our clock cleaned by a graduate from this university in New Hampshire in 2000, when John McCain beat George Bush in the Republican primary, George Bush took the loss just like this. We go to South Carolina and George Bush on and beat John McCain. No high-fiving, no exultations. He took the victory, just like this. And I remember thinking at the time that this is the type of leader you want to work for. Someone who doesn't get emotional, who even in important emotional moments is steady, calm, and able. Because what happens at a moment of crisis is people look up to the boss to get their feel for how they should react. And if the boss is nervous, if the boss is uneasy, if the boss seems to be wavering, the subordinates will do the same. But when you, as future leaders, understand that your reaction, particularly in a moment of crisis, will affect the reaction of all your subordinates, be mindful that leadership involves your body language, how you react, what you do, and it instills that mission again into everybody else. One other point that I observed inside the White House that now goes well beyond September 11th, and it may sound trivial, but it's not, and this is why I'm going to share it with you. Another part of leadership that I noticed was the busiest person in the world with the most important job in the world began every meeting precisely on time. And I was never a punctual person myself, having spent 16 years on Capitol Hill, working for a bunch of congressmen and a senator, where things just kind of went along, and then you had to go out and they had to vote, and they're always late for everything. Commander-in-Chief began everything exactly on time. We as a staff, of course, were always on time for the meetings with the president. Who isn't? But here's what it did. I came to the realization if my boss can begin all his meetings on time, as important as he is, I can begin all my meetings on time. And all my subordinates then showed up for the meetings on time, and they began their meetings on time. And it created a culture of efficiency, a culture where things worked the way they were supposed to work. It is amazing the little things that you do as a leader that your subordinates will look up to you and emulate, in addition to the big things at the moments of crisis where they'll look up to you and emulate. The captain, the commandant said to you at the beginning here that as a leader your responsibility is to your subordinates. And boy, is that true. That's what leadership is about. Without ever saying a word, is instilling followership in those around you because they see in you calm, determination, smarts, ability, confidence. And so therefore, when something happens, they right away salute and follow you, not just because they're ordered to, because they want to. That's what I saw from the inside about how leadership works. So I'll stop right there, and I can't wait to take your questions. I just hope you'll be nicer and throw more softballs than the White House press corps.
Thank you, Mr. Fleischer. Great. Mrs. Gehant, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And they don't throw softballs. I heard the questions yesterday. Very challenging. Good morning, everyone. And first, I, along with the colleagues on the panel, would like to thank the Academy, and especially the conference planners. Being an individual who plans events like this for the Federal Reserve System, I know the amount of work and planning that goes into bringing you together for these couple of days here. And especially to Sarah Grant, who was my initial point of contact, and to Robin Wegley, who's been my colleague taking me around and making sure I didn't get lost or in trouble these few days and showing me a wonderful tour. This is my first visit to the Academy, and as I told my colleagues around and some of my friends and family that I'd be coming here, they said, well, how is it that you got an invitation to come to the Naval Academy? What's your connection? And I said, well, I really don't have a connection, and then I stopped because actually, I have two very strong connections, and when you think about your passionate purpose, and maybe one of my purposes for being here today is to honor both my father, who is a Marine and served in the Korean War and is up above looking down on me, probably proud as any father could be, and my uncle, who was a Marine helicopter pilot in Vietnam and is still with me, and it kind of takes the place as my father's been gone for a couple of years. So I'm very proud to be here and very honored to be among you. My story is going to be a little bit different than some that I heard yesterday, but I think in the spirit of this conference and the Commandant's comments today is to open your mind and listen to all the perspectives, and then leave here tomorrow with your notebooks that I see so many of you writing in, and have that as something to reflect on and take action on. So joining in yesterday's session, it was so encouraging to hear the conference comments, but more importantly, your questions and ideas. And I think that that is encouraging when you talk about developing a leadership culture of how to create an environment where there's formal learning, but then opportunities to engage in dialogue and debate. And so this morning in my opening comments, I'm going to share a little bit about my takeaways from yesterday and how that can build into our discussion of the leadership culture, but then also share a little bit about the work that I do for the Federal Reserve System, because I see, and especially after yesterday and talking with many of you, so many parallels that I have taken away as a learning. So first of all, I think that in developing a culture of leadership, we talked yesterday about being clear about purpose. And when I looked through my materials for the conference and learned yesterday about some of the history of this academy, and I'm sure your institutions, whether military or private or organizations that you work with, there is in, I would bet, across your missions or focus, the word develop, developing leaders, developing midshipmen. And so being very clear that that is one of your organization's goals and objectives sets the tone right from the beginning of a culture of development and leadership. And those are words, but I think that they're easy to overlook if you don't instill the processes and infrastructure around development, such as conferences like this, to bring leaders together. So I thought it was very interesting when I looked through your materials and the conference of being clear about the purpose that is to develop. Also, probably not by coincidence, but very much by purpose, was the theme for the conference, the cycle of success. As someone who develops themes for conference on an annual basis, it's always a big debate. What should it be? What's in the forefront of people's minds now? And the cycle of success said to me that the people who put this together, the folks in the front row to the folks who are your seniors planning this event, know that it is a cycle and there's movement. Cycle says there's movement. It's not as if we or the folks yesterday were here to talk about a point in time and here are the answers. Here's what development is. Here's what the culture is. Here are the capabilities that you need moving forward upon your graduation. But it is a cycle and movement. And I appreciated the Commandant's comment today about there will be failures. So in that cycle, you know that there will be failures and a great opportunity to learn from them. Being a lifelong learner, I think some folks have talked about this morning already, is very critical. And what you take away from today is more important than the days here together. And when we start our conferences, that is always a key point that we make in our leadership development in the Federal Reserve System, is we've created the environment for the dialogue, the debate, the discussion, but it's what you do from this point forward with it, taking it back not only to use yourself, but to give to others is very critical. And so that message has been clearly delivered, I think, starting yesterday and today to all of you around a culture of development. The other thing is that development is dynamic. In the Federal Reserve, I think, very much like your organizations and institutions, there's a tremendous history. And that history can be so rewarding. Robin took me around yesterday, and oh goodness, the sense of history and the things we saw. Saw John Paul Jones's crypt, the old pirate. You can get really engulfed in that history. And I think the same is true with the Federal Reserve as we get ready in the next few years to celebrate only our 100th year of existence. However, that history has to be something that you take forward and determine. Ron Heifetz, Harvard business professor, talks about the history looking at what's precious and what's expendable. What do you learn from the history? What do you bring forward into today's culture that you can value and maintain? But then you need to make room for the new parts too, the new culture, the evolving culture, the Twitters versus the Rolodexes. And so in the course of your learning and appreciation for your organizations, and as you work as a leader and with other leaders, it's bringing forward the history, learning from it, valuing from it, but then also having an eye on the future. And yesterday and already this morning, we've talked about the importance of having that vision that a leader's role is to develop a culture that both respects and honors and learns from that history, but takes it to look forward to the future. And that's something that I hope we can talk about this morning, too. It requires an adaptive mindset. And I sat yesterday next to Colonel McCoy. I got to get all the rankings right. And I watched as he had his notebook open, one much like mine, and took notes at Marcus Buckingham's session and the types of questions that were being asked of the panel. And I look in the front row, and the gentlemen, they all have different rankings, I won't even try to remember, are taking notes on the conversation. Lifelong learning at every level of a leadership assignment is important. And they seem to call you the returning warriors or the warriors. In our organization, we call them the silverback gorillas, because they tend to be the elder folks of the organization. And in the jungle, the silverback gorillas are the one who have the history, who are looked to in times of crisis for what can we learn, what do we need to take moving forward. And you hope that those folks, those warriors or those silverback gorillas, have been paying attention and have been lifelong learners and will adapt as they move forward. And I encourage all of you, as you graduate and move on to your assignments and commissions, to move forward and say, what have I learned, but how am I constantly adapting each day and with each experience that I have. The other component that we talk about in our leadership conferences and other initiatives is leading from any chair, and that's already been brought up. Anybody has the opportunity to be a leader, and yesterday we discussed being born, being developed, and really that it's yes, both. I think it's imperative that leaders, as they work with others in their organizations or units, are looking and encouraging that leadership capability that that person may not have on the org chart, might not be their title, might not be their bars or stripes, but that they are leading, that they are in their communities, in their schools, coaching in their kids' soccer teams, football teams, that they are demonstrating leadership and how to pull that into whatever role or capability that they have. And I like this idea about operating in the white space. So that is where they have their opportunity to shine as a leader, to develop, and to make an even greater impact. So the leading from any chair is a challenge. And in a culture such as yours, and I think such as ours in the Federal Reserve, where there tends to be great subject matter expertise that people are very proud and rely upon, several layers of hierarchy, the finding the voice to lead from any chair and how to do that in a critical way, in a complete way, and in a productive way is a critical part of developing a leadership culture. Within the Fed, we developed our leadership agenda about 10 years ago or so. Feels like a little bit longer, but about 10 years ago. And like your organizations or institutions, we have an overarching mission and purpose, but several different districts and banks within our Federal Reserve System. And so while all of those, it was important to honor and have them operate independently, we did feel it was important to bring leaders together in forums such as this, at multiple levels of our organization, to talk about our culture, to develop a common language and common core vision around what we were expecting of leaders. And to take days out from what is normally your very aggressive and busy work schedule, academic schedule, teaching schedule, to have the conversation about leadership and what our metrics were around that. And so in my capacity, I have the opportunity to work with leaders at all levels. We started at the top. I think it was important to start with the silverback gorillas in our organization. And we worked with them on defining what our leadership agenda would be for the Federal Reserve System and what were the key messages that we wanted and that we wanted them involved with in teaching to our leaders as they came into our organization. And so we have an annual conference or opportunity to work with them on their leadership. And then we put it down to the next level, which I think is probably the most core and key level in the Federal Reserve System. And that program we call our trailblazers, because these are the people really on the front line. Most of them having been managers, as we talked about yesterday, but now stepping into pushing the organization forward, leading with vision, leading with purpose. And that is a much broader group of individuals in our organization, and we work with them over several different sessions throughout the year from across the country to come together, and it happens to be in Chicago, grateful it's not this week in Chicago, to talk about leadership, to have them identify what their purpose is, what their capabilities are, identify those weaknesses, and then come up with a plan for how they will address those, surrounding themselves with others who have capabilities and engaging a broader group of people in their leadership mission. And then the third group that we work with is our group that we call Thrive. And these are our newest leaders, people who are 2 or 3 years into our organization, who have, through their capability and interest and purpose, stepped into leadership roles, are those folks who are operating in the white space, and we want to nurture that, help them find mentors, help them gain experience and broad exposure to others in the organization so that they have not just their functional or rather narrow perspective of the area that they're leading now, but the broader perspective of what our organization is focused on, the leadership challenges, the key messages, and the culture that we want to instill. So that's a little bit about how we do it in the Federal Reserve System, and also, I think, connected to the work that you did yesterday with Marcus Buckingham and the other panelists. The other thing I would say is, I think Colonel McCoy said yesterday, your actions speak so loudly, I can't hear what you say. That's something I wrote in my notes yesterday. And that's a little bit what culture is about. Every organization that I work with and have been a part of, they have the culture statements on the wall and something they hand out to you. And on their website, you can see our culture is this, our vision is this. But really, in developing a culture, in particular of leadership, it's the actions, it's the doing, it's the accountability that speaks so loudly that in many ways you don't even have to say the words. You see and feel and experience the words. So with that, I'll turn it over. Look forward to the questions.
Okay, thank you. And finally, Mr. Havenstein.
Well, good morning. It is nice to be back in Annapolis. I started my life here in Annapolis. I was born at the Naval Academy Hospital in 1949. So to say that my roots are in Annapolis is putting it mildly. I don't get to spend nearly enough time in Annapolis, but it is always a pleasure to be here, even on a balmy day like we have today. Now, I'm from New Hampshire, so this is a balmy day. And when it gets 32 degrees in January in New Hampshire, people are wearing shorts. First of all, it's a delight for me to be here. I am grateful for the class of '56 of the Naval Academy and your sponsorship of this forum, and very consistent with no breaking the links. Leadership is indeed a lifelong journey. And it's for those of us in class of '71, we are very, very grateful for your classmates and your continued emphasis on leadership and support of this conference here at the Naval Academy. And I really also appreciate the opportunity to join these panelists. Ari's comment about 9/11, for many of you out there, 9/11 was something that happened when you're in junior high school, maybe even before. But in all instances, I know people on this panel, it is a very personal inflection point in our lives. And for me, because a good friend and classmate, Chick Burlingame, was flying the airplane that went into the Pentagon. And there probably isn't a day that goes by that we don't think about our fallen colleagues and citizens from that day. I also lost a lot of good friends who were firemen in New York City, because I had the pleasure as a Marine Reservist to command a Marine Reserve unit, many of whom, those reservists, were firemen. And so that event had a lot of personal impact on a lot of people in this country. At SAIC, we start our day with these words. Standing, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. Now, I know there's some non-U.S. citizens here Otherwise, I'd have you all join me in that. It's important from a cultural aspect to know every staff meeting, every leadership meeting, every day, we start with who we are. And that the nature of what the 45,000 people at SAIC do every day, and the nature of the things when I was at BAE Systems for 10 years that they do every day, is around that singular thought of doing things and solving hard problems that are important to our nation. That, in effect, drives the entire culture of our company. And it's not done frivolously. It is not done in some sophomoric fashion. It is done with purpose, just like every day you get up with some degree of purpose. I also know that it's very difficult when you're 22 or 21 and you haven't had necessarily the leadership opportunities, even though you may have been raised in the cradle of a leadership laboratory. In fact, it always amazed me when I thought back at some of my classmates who were basically dirtbags, pretty low down in the peer grease, academically much more successful than I was, by the way, how transformative their first leadership role in the fleet was. And coming back to a reunion after 5 years and seeing the transformation, said, what happened to them? Not only are they squared away, they're doing marvelously well. And how many of those deep selected for major or for lieutenant commander or, frankly, in some cases, for flag were surprises when we thought about them back in their context up on 7-4 or 8-4. The point I would make to you is the nature of leadership. Yes, it is a lifelong thing, but it's also driven by the circumstances leaders are in. And when you graduate or commence, whatever we call that, you will assume a role that is fundamentally different than the role you've been assuming for the last 4 years. And I think most of you will be amazed by how well prepared you are, but more importantly, how extraordinarily good you and your classmates are when it comes to leading. Now let me get specific about the questions that were asked. In what way is leadership development in organizations dependent upon the field of work and organizational environment and which characteristics might be universal? It is all dependent upon the environment. It is all dependent upon the purpose of the organization, the enduring or non-enduring nature of that purpose, and the diversity and dynamics of the membership of the organization. And things that are effective at Google, frankly, wouldn't be so effective in 1st Platoon, Dog Company, 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines. I've been characterized as, by some, including my wife, as merely a Marine platoon commander masquerading as a CEO. Now, I've masqueraded twice as a CEO, so I at least figured out that part. But the reality is, when it comes to business or large organizations, the nature of leadership development of those organizations is fundamentally driven by the purpose of that organization, its enduring or non-enduring nature, all right, and the dynamics of the members of the organization. In what ways do organizations foster culture that reward and enhance leader development? And how do the methods and programs used affect the outcomes of such programs? Listen, You get what you celebrate, and you get what you reward. In the service, we celebrate promotions. We celebrate changes of command. Heck, we'll have a parade for just about anything and anybody. In fact, we were talking a little bit about graduation or commencement, the Commandant and Midshipman was. My wife, who graduated from Maryland and University of Maryland, I understand there may be a University of Maryland student here, and if I say something inappropriate, I apologize in advance. But since I have 6 brothers and sisters who all went to Maryland, my wife went to Maryland, my 2 sisters-in-law went to Maryland, and I've got a nephew playing in the marching band. I got Maryland stuff all over my house. I hate it. But one of her great accomplishments, she said, she graduated with honors from the University of Maryland in education and French, having never attended a varsity sports event, been in the library, and did not go to graduation. Now, and why? Because graduation was a half-day event. And I think of that in the context of the Naval Academy and what we celebrate. Commencement or graduation in the Naval Academy is a week-long happening. All right? Starts with the transition of our plebes to no more plebes, right on up to the commissioning ceremony when our midshipmen become commissioned officers and throw their covers in the air. That's what we celebrate. That's what shapes culture. In fact, I have a firm belief, once you make field grade officer in the military, your principal purpose is to uphold tradition and the institution, because most of the fighting's done by E5s and below and O3s and below. So the purpose of programs or projects or rewards incentives are all designed to reinforce the culture. The last question that was asked, the effect of crucible or trial-by-fire events, I will simply say they have both a short-term and a long-term impact to the extent you want them to have that. All right? If it's in the context of becoming a United States Marine, it has a lifelong impact. In the context of other events, it's much more social in nature and doesn't tend to have the lifelong impact. The impact of those types of activities or events, shared experiences, is directly related to the intensity of the emotional energy that goes into that event or that experience. And so if you're going to use those kinds of events as a culture developing and sustaining and enduring aspect of the culture, then it has to have a very significant emotional element. One last thing on leadership. Leaders develop leaders. I can tell you, wherever I've been, I have never subordinated my responsibility and accountability for developing leaders to others. A third of the time I spent as a CEO, either at BA Systems or at this the company I'm currently with, SAIC, a third of my time is on leadership development. And you will, as leaders, whether you're leading Marines, sailors, soldiers, airmen, businesses, you will find your effectiveness as a leader is directly proportional to the amount of teaching that you do in leaders. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you very much. Okay, as promised and expected, we have plenty to think about from our 4 panelists. So I'll give you a moment. I see some people already moving to the microphones. I will simply go back and forth. I believe they're set up on both sides as they were yesterday. So I'll move back and forth between them. And we'll begin here on this side. Sir. I think you may need to just flip that switch on the top. Yep, there we go.
All right. So my name is Patrick Coughlin, coming from the Jepson School of Leadership Studies, University of Richmond. This question goes out to Mr. Havenstein. My question for you, sir, it's no secret that I'd say the majority of the workers in private defense companies are prior service in the military and still maintain pretty deep connections to active duty members. How does the leader maintain a culture of integrity and I'd say fair competition while you're working with and I guess offering business proposals to many of your colleagues who you've previously worked with? How do you mitigate that risk of conflict of interest or other pertaining risks that you might encounter as you go about your business? Thank you, sir.
In the context of your question, first of all, congratulations for attending University of Richmond, whose leadership school is extraordinary. If the question is how do I maintain a conflict of separate the conflict of interest between the work I do and the folks that work at our company, is that kind of the nature of it? Well, first of all, I don't see that as a conflict. I really don't see a lot of conflict. The nature of the people that work at SAIC are people who fundamentally believe in the noble and the noble nature of the work. All right? And it doesn't matter whether you're a veteran or not a veteran. All right? Again, it goes back to being comfortable to start your day with the Pledge of Allegiance, right? That kind of transcends all the other aspects of the workforce. And we have workers, 2,000 researchers at the National Cancer Institute developing a cure for cancer, right? And we also have 2,000 people turning wrenches down in Charleston, South Carolina, building MRAPs, right? And so but what is common around that group is the noble nature of the work that is important to our nation. So I think it's pretty easy when you kind of raise things above whether or not you came from the military or not to something that, at least in our workforce, people can respect. Okay?
Okay, this side, sir.
I'm Russell Rodewald from MIT, specifically the Gordon Engineering Leadership Program. My question is for Mr. Fleischer. If a leader is called to lead people to a better future with a clear vision, and a leader and his team encounter a situation that is very complicated and has a high level of technical detail, if the people who the leader is serving ask questions and demand a high level of technical detail, how can the leader communicate with those people in a way that inspires trust?
Well, I think the answer to that goes beyond whether it's technical or engineering. It's a general idea about how decisions are made. And from my experience, the best way to have decisions made, particularly involving controversy, is one, and so much of leadership begins here, your hiring decisions. Who is it that's on your team? Did you put people on your team who are sharp, who are able, who will challenge you, who have experience, who are team players? Two, once you've got your right team in place, do you have a process where everybody on the team can be heard? And what I observed firsthand at the White House was we would typically have what was called policy time, where the various decision makers or advisors would come in and present to the president the pros and cons of different issues. And they'd say, here are three options that we see. Here's the good on this one, the bad on this one, the good on this one, the bad on this one, the good on this one, bad on this one. And then people would clash. And the president, listening, would learn and pick up where the clashes were, where the weaknesses are, where the faults might be if he goes one road or another road, read the body language of people, somebody who would make a recommendation and then kind of instantly withdraw or hedge as soon as they were challenged. Well, that tells the president, maybe that guy's not so sure about it. So it's the meetings that are set up so ideas can be heard and decision makers can decide. That, to me, allows expertise to filter up and for decision makers then to hear it all. I'll say one last thing on that point, and it's an interesting part about how Washington works and how the press works. One of the things I was really proud of in the Bush White House was we'd have these meetings in the Oval Office where the clashes were great. I mean, Karen Hughes and Carl Rove, other people against other people. Believe it or not, when you fly, you know those gigantic machines now that scan your luggage before you check them? There was a big debate in the federal government about whether those machines, one, were any good, whether they worked, whether they had so many false positives, how expensive they were. One of the greatest clashes I ever saw was whether those machines should be mandated. And two people really got into it in front of the president about yes or no, should we make sure every airline, every airport has those machines. It was a great fight. I just watched it. None of it ever leaked. And in Bush's father's administration, everything leaked. One powerful person against another powerful person, they'd make their case, and you could read about it the next day in the Washington Post. And it was the hiring decision where the president put team players around him who weren't hesitant to give him frank advice, but then none of us turned on each other. Also because we had a fair system where you knew you could get the ear of the president. You knew your boss was listening. Another leadership lesson. Your subordinates will do the right thing if you have a fair process in place where they know they can reach you. Now, you don't have to always agree with them, but they want to know, this isn't working, boss. I need to have your ear. You need to know what I hear. Well, put the right people in the room, let them respectfully clash, and it helps decision makers make the right decisions.
Thank you, sir.
I was going to add to that comment, in a similar model within the Federal Reserve System with the current financial crisis, exactly that type of a structure was implemented by senior leadership, where bringing together on a daily basis the 7:30 and the 4:30 meetings, and any person from any function, whether it was human resources, typically all the economists were there, the regulators, the human resources folks, the IT folks were welcome to come and join in those conversations in the heat of it, so that the most senior leadership would be challenged with different perspectives. We like to call it the obligation to dissent in a constructive way, different point of views. But at the end of that process, a decision needs to be made, or a point of view needs to be brought forward, and a conversation around what we would call the 80% agreement, 20% maybe you disagree, but 100% of the folks walking out of that room will support and abide by that decision or course of action. So I think a very similar model is being used now, or especially in the heat of the crisis.
Thank you. And
Good
back
morning.
to this side.
Good morning, Midshipman Curtis from the Boston Unit, ROTC. And I would like to ask the entire panel this question. It's something that's more developed over the past day, but it seems good to confront with the culture of leadership. And it's something that Mr. Havenstein talked about a little bit when he said that every day he begins the morning with saying the Pledge of Allegiance. Now, of course, that's obviously a good thing, and this has been brought up, and of course we're at a military, most of us come from military institutions, we are at the Naval Academy, but it seems that these leadership cultures are confined, as in that you can only access so many people in order for it to make it effective. And I personally see this most by the fact, in what I find somewhat alarming, in that over a day of this conference, I don't think anyone has mentioned service, as in not just the job, because obviously military is service, but going outside the job, confronting the weaknesses of other people, because most of leadership that we've talked about is utilizing the strengths, which of course is important, but that service and doing things that aren't our specialty and reaching out to those people that are less in a good state than we are. So my question is rather threefold. One, am I just wrong, and have I just been missing something this entire conference? Two, why? And then three, how to change it? And thank you.
Okay, there's a lot in that question. Very good.
Okay.
Anybody like to take that first? Captain
Well,
Cyrus?
sure. There's a lot in that question. If you haven't heard service, then maybe we haven't been explicit enough. But leadership is all about service. As a matter of fact, success is only useful to the extent it benefits others. And when you're leading, I guess our presumption is that you're leading with some purpose, there's some defined cause, and there's something about you that makes people want to follow you. And they're following you because they perceive there's some benefit or growth for them. I think, and I think my fellow panelists would agree that service is at the heart of leadership. It's at the heart of leadership. And if you think about it, if you take our hierarchy and let's flip it upside down, you know, the leader's down here, and you're holding up all of these people. Now that's service. That's the gift that keeps on giving. And so if people are going out and doing other great things for people in their lives, you know, they're carrying your name on their back. That's your legacy. So if you've taught people how to be of service to others, and even with my boys, you know, what are you going to do in life? Oh, I'm going to do this. Great. What service will you be providing in order to do that? So maybe we haven't been explicit enough, but let me be clear. Service is at the root of leadership.
Let me just quickly weigh in on something I said earlier. You said you employ 35,000 people? 45,000? Sorry to those 10,000. 45,000. I'm a free market capitalist. And when I hear a man say, I have 45,000 people who have a home, a roof over their head, money in their pocket because of a job created in the private sector, that's service. The very fact that people can make a living in America is because of our private sector. And that's the ultimate service. It's what separates us and strengthens us and makes us a free, great country, is that private sector. So I'm also one who says service is most coming from the private sector. For the people who fall through the cracks, the government needs to have a safety net, and it's a safety net that people can bounce off of, not get trapped. But private sector equals service to me because it creates jobs, and that creates opportunity.
I would agree on the other panelists' comments, and then just add that in talking about the infrastructure, I think you made a comment that culture can be defined to kind of a small group of people that understand it. And I think that can be the risk in some organizations, and I think that does happen. But if you structure the experience and the expectation and the accountability for those people who are participating, engaged in a conference leadership experience like this, to then take that out to the folks that report to them, to their communities, then you have that breadth and that impact that I think you're talking about is important to have in terms of impact of a culture.
Large organizations invariably have some aspect of what, as you described, services, community outreach, if they have any leadership kind of thought at all. And it usually manifests itself in simply empowering people, all right, and then encouraging people and colleagues to contribute to their community in some fashion. It may differ depending on the nature of the organization, but I don't, in this country at least, there is just an inherent role of our citizens in serving their communities. So it's embedded in virtually everything from small business to very large businesses, right? So I wouldn't think for a second that you should take away that that's not an aspect of the leadership and culture of just about every enterprise in the country.
Very good. All right, back to this side.
Good morning. My name is Bob Bury. I'm with Penn State University's College of Engineering Leadership Program. Professor Thomas, would you comment on how teaching leadership at the Academy has changed over the last 10 years? Why has it changed? And what results are you hoping to affect? What are the midshipmen able to do as they graduate today that they might not have been able to do 10 years ago? And of course, I'd be interested in any of the panelists' comments about how they see this whole field changing over the last 5 to 10 years? Thank you.
Okay, well, I will start that one then. In terms of my observation of what's going on here at the Naval Academy, I'll also apply this in a broader sense to some of the things that I've seen in leader development in other settings, because I've had some really interesting opportunities for outreach here beyond the Naval Academy. And I think what I've seen here is echoed in some of the other places I've been. And that is, I think there's a much more systematic approach to the study of leadership today than there was 10 years or earlier. For those of you familiar with the way leadership has been approached in terms of development education, we've gone from really not that long ago, this assumption that certain individuals were kind of destined to leadership. It's kind of rooted in a theory called the trait theory of leadership. And although the behaviorists and other folks who started introducing how human beings interact and how that's important to understand sociology, psychology, philosophy perhaps, and this broad variety of disciplines to truly understand leadership, although that approach has been around for over 50 years, it really hasn't been accepted in many institutions of higher learning, truly accepted as a discipline unto itself until fairly recently. And since that has been adopted in higher education and in the developmental programs of the public and private sector, I'd say elsewhere, I think the programs themselves have improved dramatically. No longer is leadership development just constrained to the telling of stories of great individuals and their exploits. To truly understand and be capable as a leader, you have to understand the human condition, and it begins with that. And oh, by the way, you have to understand the important philosophies that have governed human interaction and the important questions as well. So I think the next 10 years actually are very promising, very exciting, because within the next 10 years, Jepson, somebody, I think the first question was from the University of Richmond, and the Jepson School. Well, schools like Jepson at University of Richmond are no longer going to be alone. They're going to be standalone programs, highly respected within the academy. I don't mean academy as in service academy, but the broader academy, as being a legitimate discipline, worthy and distinct by itself. So that's my observation. Others?
I have a quick comment on that, yes. Because many years ago, in working toward my PhD, I did a study on the leadership programs at the Naval Academy, West Point, and the Air Force Academy. And I don't know, this must have been like 10, 15 years, something like that. And it was interesting because we were following the traditional patterns. We were studying the motivation theory and all of those things that we know contribute to being good leaders. But we still kind of had that scientific method kind of focus, in the management realm and how you get things done and where you place blocks and organization and all those sorts of things. What I've seen over the last few years is, we introduced this word of transformation. We start to talk about change, and then we seem to have a regard for the person. The person as a human being. We care about personality, we care about strengths, we care about development, and those sorts of things. And we're not seeing people in terms of, just a cog in the wheel kind of sense. I mean, it was a great opportunity to look at the programs way back then, and then with Dr. Thomas, allowing me to, join his teaching staff, in addition to other stuff I do. It's been extraordinary, and I love the approach that we are taking here at the Academy, and it's very, personal. Then you get into the team, organization. I mean, it's very clear, it's outlined, and that's the change I've seen.
Just add very quickly that the change that I've seen is moving from this studying of leadership, which is a component, to practice and action learning components of any leadership development program. Really having leaders experience and practice leadership concepts, get 360 feedback, know what their strengths and weaknesses are, have very aggressive development plans on how they want to address that versus being more of the neck-ups where I'm reading it and listening to it but not doing anything with it, and much more accountability to do something with your leadership development.
Great. Yeah, for your educators, I would agree on that last point. Taking it from the cognitive domain to the affective domain, I suppose, is the difference, made all the difference in leadership development. So, great question. Thank you.
I have found that communication is becoming a big problem with email and text messaging, and a lot of face-to-face communication is going out the window. Have you seen that becoming a problem, or is it creating problems in the upcoming generation, becoming more technological proficient, but less personally?
Okay. A commonly heard thing that this current generation, millennials or the Y generation, is characterized as having challenges in traditional means of communication. Right? Anybody like to take that first?
My grandfather came to this country in 1939. He and his family fled the Nazis, got out in August of 39, 1 week before the Nazi invasion of Poland. When a wonderful man in my life. I listened to him immensely, and he used to tell me regularly how everything changes, and you just have to go with the change. And it amazed me that this man, he died in his mid-90s, he was the youngest person I ever knew. He always just thought ahead, and I loved it. My point to you is that these changes are the way life is, and I suppose people in the old days when everybody just gathered on their front porch and talked to their neighbors who walked 10 miles to say hi to them, they might have regretted that the car came along, because when the car came along, people didn't sit on their front porch as much, and they missed those conversations. Such is life. And I tweeted before I came here how I did this morning, proud I was to come to the Naval Academy, and how honored I always am to be around the military. So I sent that out to my 3 followers. You know, I think human interaction will always be the core of what we do, principally because if you have children, you're not tweeting to your child, you're raising a child. And so everything stems from that, grows from that, and everything else, it's a different form of communication, whether it was going to radio, going to television, going to Facebook, going to Twitter, going to who knows what's next, it's just a technological way of speaking. Don't lose sight of your fundamentals, but it'll never faze me, it'll never bother me, it's just the way life is.
By the way, because of our whole social networking thing, you know, I really want you guys to be conscious of the fact that, you know, your world is open. And so when you're sending things out to your friends, and, you know, I know my sons have like a gazillion friends, you're representing who you are. So you can use that as an opportunity to, you know, in a positive way, or, you know, just remember, you're always on record. You are always on record. So while some of our human interaction may be reduced, our reach is incredible. So if you have something great to say, you know, we have a means for you to really get your message out. But trust me, when you're 30 and we start pulling up videos on YouTube of you, it might not be so cool then. So just be conscious of that.
Please keep that in mind for photos taken at Buddy's last night. Anything else from other panelists on this point? Okay, then we'll go to the other side. Sir.
Morning. Good morning. My name is Christian Hugerheid. I'm from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. Mr. Fleischer, you highlighted how President Bush was calm and collected, you know, during periods of great success and periods of failure. And Mr. Havenstein, you mentioned that the impact of crucible events is related to the intensity of the emotional elements. Well, my question is, when is it appropriate to show emotion, particularly strong emotion, when in a position of leadership? It's
a great question, and it's an interesting issue that's being raised now with President Obama. I think that President Obama's cool, calm, collected nature was a huge asset to him when he ran against John McCain, who was much more volatile and mercurial. And for a young candidate for president who did not have significant experience, his nature helped convince people he can hold that office because look how calm and cool he is. Flip to today, unemployment, all the problems in the world, and people say the president doesn't emote, he's not connecting. So these things are cycles also. George Bush, of course, was extremely emotional. I remember on September 13th when he announced that he was going to New York City the next day. I had brought the press into the Oval Office to have him watch a phone call that he made to Governor Pataki and Mayor Giuliani announcing he was coming to New York. And at the end of that, a reporter said to him, "Mr. President, how are you feeling right now?" Which was a phenomenal question because everything for 3 days had just been about what does the nation need. There is no thought of yourself in these jobs. And a reporter pierced him and asked that, and he started to cry. And on national TV, he said, "I'm a caring guy, but at a time like this, my only thought is of the people who are suffering and what America will do about it." And he cried and walked straight out of the Oval Office because he knew he was going to lose it. So we connect with people on different levels, and it's interesting that as leaders, you have to show a way to all those who follow you from both intellectual, emotional, sometimes steady, ways that people will connect with you while always being true to your nature. You can't fake it. And so it's a phenomenal question about every individual's differences and how they are within and what they are able to show. There's no right answer. It takes a mix, I suppose, but at all times you just have to be true to who you are.
I have nothing but to echo what Ari said, that when you put it in the context of the enduring nature of some activity, though, it's not in essence necessary to show your emotion, but there are things that tug on you emotionally, all right? And put yourself in an environment that is emotionally stressful tends to have a much more enduring effect than not, as opposed to exhibiting emotion as a leader. I think I couldn't agree more with what Ari said. You have to be true to yourself. And so emotions will come from your own journey line in life. All right? And one of the difficult things is when you're 22, that journey line hasn't had a lot of ups and downs. All right? And in fact, one of the things that gets beyond the academic nature of leadership is, I think, from the 40 years when I was here and to today, is the acknowledgement that knowing who you are is the most important aspect of your own leadership. And then being true to those, whatever those virtues or beliefs or whatever makes you up, is that consistency is also very important in your effectiveness as a leader.
Great, thank you. Back to this side. I think it's working.
Good morning, Cadet Jarrett, Virginia Tech. This is for any or all members of the panel. Mr. Walt Havenstein, I believe you mentioned that leadership and success is driven by the purpose of the organization. Looking at the current culture of gridlock and infighting in our government, mainly the Senate and the House, do you believe that these government officials have forgotten their true purpose for why they are there? And have these officials and even us who elect them lost touch with this idea of real cultural leadership that has purpose and direction that I see much of our government lacking in its current state? Our concepts seem to work great with the hierarchical systems in our military and in the corporate world, but our government seems to have too many chiefs and not enough Indians at the moment. Thank you.
Just a comment real quick. First of all, I respect all the folks who are willing to engage in the political process and serve us. I may not agree with very many of them, but I respect them. And frankly, I get to spend an awful lot of time with the political leaders on the Hill, not necessarily the White House, although I can tell you some stories on George W. Bush when he came to New Hampshire in the primaries of 2000. Very interesting man. These are marvelous people. These, by and large, are self-effacing. They're trying to do what they think is in the best interest of the country. And inevitably, they're going to have different points of view. And a little bit of our system in and itself, it creates a combative nature. Now, it doesn't help that we get 24/7 sound bites from these characters. And in fact, I don't watch TV. I listen to my wife. And she's a C-SPAN junkie, so I get all the stuff I need. But I yeah, it seems that way from here. And more we're learning how the sausage is made into form of legislation on Capitol Hill and through the administration. But these are marvelous people. And I don't want you to ever think that they aren't. The process has gotten a little dysfunctional, and frankly, our role as citizens is to keep reminding them when we think it's dysfunctional. You know, we are very, very lucky. We got a lot of problems in this country, but we get to fix most of them every 2 to 4 years. We get to decide, we get another swing at the bat. Right? People of Egypt's got a different view, right? So I probably am probably much more charitable when it comes to our elected officials and our political appointees. These are very, very hard jobs. They're these are very, very talented people by and large. And yes, naturally, they're going to have different points of view. Hey, that's America, right? And frankly, that's what I like about America.
And it always has been America. I mean, if you go back to our history, I mean, remember, politics is just an excuse not to engage in violence. I mean, when you think about what's happening in Egypt and you think about what happens here, it is a thin line between violence and political rhetoric. Political rhetoric in America means there is no violence, really. But if we didn't have a government that was noisy, where people could clash, the alternative is violence. But go back to the founding of our country. You know, in 1800, it was said in the election between Jefferson and Adams, you couldn't walk across the street without caning somebody from the opposite party. And back then, you think the things we say about each other today are rough? You know, the guy's a flip-flopper. Shoot, back then they called each other bastards, bigamists, illegitimate. That was the regular cries that they made. And after the revolution, the worst thing you could say about somebody was said about Alexander Hamilton. He's a monarchist. That'd be like today saying somebody's a member of Al-Qaeda. And we just fought a revolution against the monarchists, and you're a monarchist. I mean, we have always had a noisy system. Thomas Jefferson hired a newspaper editor and put him on payroll at the State Department when he was Secretary of State to surreptitiously, anonymously write nasty things about John Adams. Now, gridlock? The fact of the matter is actually a lot does get done. And look at last December, how much legislation got enacted into law, including the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, whatever people think of it. Our system does make a lot of noise, but I think the criticism of gridlock and partisanship is overblown. It actually does get a lot of stuff done with a lot of noise. So I'm in that same category.
In the interest of keeping us on track for time, and apologies to the folks who have outstanding questions still, we're going to have to wrap it up there. I'd like you to join me, if you will, in thanking our panelists today for their insights.